beautiful widow hid her tears behind a smile. No one understood. She still set 2 bowls of rice every morning. That was the thing the assessors could not understand. They had catalogued it 17 times across 17 mornings. The widow on sublevel 4 of Block 9, Provisional Sector Nana, formerly known as Shibuya, and every morning she placed 2 white ceramic bowls on the low table by the window, filled both from the same pot, and sat down across from the empty space where her husband used to be. She ate from her own bowl slowly. She never touched his. When she was done, she carried both bowls to the sink, washed them together, dried them together, and set them back in the cabinet side by side. The assessors filed it under behavioral residue. Complicated grief expression, low disruption index, no threat signature. They moved on. They were wrong about everything except the last part. Her name was Sira Machida. She was 31 years old. Her husband Kenji had been dead for 8 months, 2 weeks and 4 days, and she had not cried once in front of a window, a reflective surface, a lens, or any of the 17 passive collection nodes embedded in the walls of her unit. The Muhari Collective required emotional transparency from all provisional tier residents. It was written into the Cohabitation Accord, the document that humans had signed not at a table, but on their knees, in the rubble of what used to be the Harajuku district, while the Muhari fleet held low orbit like a second sky made of cold fire. Sira had read the accord 3 times the night after Kenji died. She had noted the language around emotional data harvest as a condition of continued residency. She had understood what it meant. Then she had gone to the sink, run the water very cold, pressed both wrists under it until the shaking stopped, and decided something that took no words at all. She would give them nothing. Not grief, not rage, not the particular quality of despair she felt when she realized the collective had already catalogued Kenji's brain integration surgery as a successful test case before he ever came home and told her about it. Not the way she had pressed her ear against his neck that last night and heard something beneath his heartbeat that had no right to be there. A faint, rhythmic signal, mechanical and patient, like a timer. She gave them a smile instead. Not a performed one. That was the important distinction. The Muhari were extraordinary readers of performed emotion. Their collection nodes sampled microexpressions at 30 frames per second, cross-referenced against vocal stress patterns, galvanic skin response pulled from the apartment's humidity sensors, the slight infrared bloom of a face that is working to appear calm. Performed calm was detectable. Performed happiness registered to them as a kind of interference pattern, a signal with no backing frequency. What Sira had trained herself to produce was something else. She had thought about it the way Kenji used to think about his electronics work: find the authentic signal, then route it where you want it to go. The grief was real, so she let herself feel it fully, completely, in the 3 or 4 minutes each day that she spent in the building's lower maintenance corridor, where there were no nodes, only pipes sweating in the dark and the distant sound of the water recycler churning. She stood in that corridor and let it move through her like weather, let her eyes water, let her hands shake. Let herself remember the weight of him asleep beside her and the specific way he smelled of solder and cheap shampoo, and let herself understand, fully and without flinching, that she would never have that again. Then she breathed out, walked back upstairs, and by the time she opened her door, what was on her face was not a performance of okayness, but the real, settled calm of someone who has already survived the worst of it, at least for today. The assessors read it as low affect stability, provisional tier resident demonstrating adaptive coping, no anomaly. She had been doing this for 8 months. The thing she carried everywhere was what had started to attract attention. It was a small device, handheld, roughly the shape of a thick tablet, with a cracked screen along one edge that Kenji had never gotten around to fixing. To anyone who looked at it directly, it appeared to be a dead personal assistant unit, the cheap kind that the collective now distributed to provisional tier residents as part of the engagement compliance package. Most residents used them to register their daily contentment scores, stream approved cultural content from the Muhari catalog, and attend the twice-weekly integration sessions that were technically voluntary in the same way that breathing was technically voluntary. To the assessor's sensors, the device read as dormant. No active transmission, no processing signature, a battery depleted to 0. This was because Kenji had been brilliant in ways that the Muhari had not fully accounted for when they selected him for the B-chip integration trial. He had built a Faraday interior into the casing before they installed the chip. He had told Sira about it 2 nights before the surgery, sitting on the floor of their unit with his legs crossed, turning the device over in his hands, speaking in the same flat, careful voice he used when he was most frightened. "They'll want the chip to talk to everything," he'd said. "That's the whole point. The integration isn't just for the user, it's for them. It gives them a data channel straight through. Whatever the chip records from inside my head, sensory data, decision trees, emotional gradients, it all goes home." "Then don't do it," Sira had said. She had said it 11 times across the prior 3 weeks, and she said it again, now knowing it would not change anything. "If I don't do it, my work tier drops. If my tier drops below 4, we lose this unit." He'd looked at the device. "But I can make the device a dead drop, give it a shielded partition. The chip phones home, but I also get to phone somewhere else, leave something behind, in case." She had looked at him for a long time. He had looked back. "I'm going to be fine," he'd said. And because he was the worst liar she had ever loved, she had known right then that he wasn't sure. He'd gone in for the surgery on a Tuesday. He'd come home that Friday, walking carefully, a small adhesive square behind his left ear over the incision site. He'd seemed like himself, mostly. There was a new quality to his silences, not deeper, exactly, but differently shaped, as though something in the architecture of his thinking had shifted slightly to accommodate a new tenant. He'd been dead 11 weeks later. Cardiac event, the Muhari medical unit had logged. Spontaneous. The integration hardware was undamaged and had been recovered for analysis. The body had been processed within the collective's standard 72-hour window. She had not been permitted to attend a cremation because there had not been one. That was another thing she held in the maintenance corridor in the dark for 4 minutes a day. The device had been on the table when she came home from the medical station. She had known immediately what it was. She had held it against her chest for a while, just held it, her heart going hard, the dead screen reflecting nothing. And then she had taken it to the sink and run the cold water and pressed her wrists against the metal and decided again. She was going to find out what he'd left her. This was harder than it sounded. The shielded partition Kenji had built could only be opened by a specific sequence, not digital, not biometric, not transmissible. He had told her what it was in the same conversation in the same careful voice, and she had memorized it then without knowing she was memorizing it. His hands folding a piece of paper into a shape that meant something to him, the precise way he tapped 3 fingers against the edge of the table, the frequency he'd hummed under his breath while he worked. Not a code, a ritual. A gesture sequence that the device would recognize through its accelerometers and audio pickup if she performed it exactly right, in a space with no active sensor coverage. She had practiced it for weeks, in the maintenance corridor. Getting the tap sequence right, the hum right, the paper fold right, because she didn't know which element was the actual trigger, and she was terrified of getting it wrong and triggering a wipe. She got it right on the 42nd attempt. The screen lit up dim and blue in the dark corridor, not bright enough to show from the stairs above. She'd hunched over it with her coat pulled around her shoulders and read what her husband had left her, and she had not been prepared, was the truth of it. You can know intellectually that a person you love uncovered something catastrophic. You can hold that knowledge in your mind as an abstraction. But reading his voice in text, his precise, unpanicked, careful voice, getting more careful as the entries went on, the handwriting metaphor of his typing growing smaller and tighter, was something else entirely. The entries ran for 9 weeks. He'd started them 4 days post-surgery, once he understood what the chip was actually doing, and he'd written every night in the shielded partition while the chip phoned home its sanitized version of his day. What the chip was recording and transmitting was not simply behavioral data. Kenji had been, before provisional reclassification, a signal engineer. He understood transmission architectures. What he'd done with that understanding, once the chip was in, was map its actual function, and what he'd found had taken him 3 weeks to believe and another 2 weeks to document. The B-chip was not an integration enhancement, it was a farm. The Muhari were harvesting something from the provisional tier that they were not harvesting from the compliant upper tier, because the compliant upper tier would not have produced it in sufficient quantity. They were harvesting the specific neurological signature of human grief at the cellular level, the precise electromagnetic pattern of a mind processing loss that it cannot resolve, the way that grief, uniquely in the human brain, created a resonance cascade across multiple systems simultaneously that no other known sapient species could generate. They had known about this before first contact. They had come here for it. The integration surgery was not the product they were selling to provisional tier residents. It was the mechanism by which they harvested the product from provisional tier residents, who had sufficient grief, sufficient precarity, sufficient unresolvable loss in their daily lives to produce the signature in industrial quantities. The chip didn't enhance, it extracted. Slowly, carefully, without the host's awareness, drawing off the grief resonance and transmitting it home, and the slow depletion, the gradual hollowing of emotional range that many chip users reported, and the Muhari medical system attributed to integration fatigue, was the expected side effect of being quietly drained. Kenji had written near the end of his entries, "I think I understand now why the cardiac events happen. At a certain point, the extraction reaches a threshold and the system overloads. They know this. The recovery rate of the hardware after each event tells me they planned for it. We are not residents to them. We are a crop, and I think they have been doing this to someone somewhere for a very long time." The last entry was 3 days before he died. It ended mid-sentence. Sierra had read all of it in 14 minutes in the dark, crouched over the blue screen with her coat pulled around her, and she had not made a sound. Then she had closed the device, put it in her bag, walked upstairs, washed her face, made dinner, sat down at the low table and eaten. The next morning she had set 2 bowls of rice. The thing she understood that she held on to in those 4 minutes of weather each day was that the grief the Muhari wanted, the raw, unprocessed, transmitted to the node's grief, the kind that registered as high yield on whatever scale they were using, was not the grief she was producing. She had, through the 8 months of what the assessors had logged as adaptive coping, accidentally and then deliberately altered the signature of her own grief. She had processed it, not resolved it. You didn't resolve the loss of someone like Kenji. You carried it differently over time, the weight redistributed until it was load-bearing rather than crushing. But in processing it, in letting it move through her completely in the dark corridor 4 minutes a day, she had changed its electromagnetic profile. The resonance cascade the Muhari were farming required unresolved, circulating grief. What she was producing now was something the chip would have struggled to harvest even if she'd had one. She had arrived at this understanding not from Kenji's notes but from something much older and simpler. She had watched her own grandmother grieve as a child. Her grandmother had lost her husband and then her son in the same year, and she had not shattered. She had become, if anything, more concentrated, more present. She had cooked enormous meals. She had tended her garden with ferocious attention. She had laughed at things that were actually funny and cried only at things that merited it, and kept the grief tucked in close like a coal in her chest, something she fed carefully so it stayed lit but didn't spread. Sierra had thought about her grandmother every day for 8 months. She had decided to become her. The second thing she understood was that Kenji had not finished what he started. His documentation was comprehensive. His analysis was correct, but it stopped at diagnosis. He had not had time for the rest of it, or he had not known what the rest of it was, or he had trusted that she would figure it out. She had figured it out. The chip's transmission used the city's integration network as its backbone, the same network that carried the contentment score submissions, the approved cultural streams, the integration session feeds. It was a single architecture. This was efficient. It was also, as Kenji would have recognized immediately if he'd lived long enough, a single point of failure. You could not jam the network. The Muhari had distributed it too thoroughly. There was no central node, only 10,000 relay points embedded in the city infrastructure, each one hardened against physical disruption. But the signal the chips were transmitting home, the harvested grief resonance, compressed into a carrier frequency that rode on top of the approved data streams, was a narrowband transmission. It had to be narrowband to be invisible within the wider architecture. And a narrowband transmission, if you could introduce a sufficiently broad-spectrum interference source at the carrier frequency, would drown. Not disrupt, not decode, not expose, just drown. Fill the frequency with noise until the transmission couldn't get through. Not forever, they'd adapt, find a new frequency, route around it. But for however long the interference held, every chip in the network would stop transmitting. Every provisional tier resident with a B chip installed would stop being harvested, and the people running the harvest would know something was wrong, but they would not know what, because the interference would look like equipment degradation. The broad-spectrum source Sierra needed was not electronic. Electronic would be detectable, traceable, actionable. It was acoustic. The grief resonance signal used a carrier frequency that mapped, for reasons Kenji had noted with the slightly dazed fascination of a man encountering an unexpected coincidence, onto the lower range of the human singing voice. Specifically, the chest voice of a woman in her early 30s. Specifically, the resonant frequency of a particular kind of sustained vowel sound produced under emotional pressure. Specifically, a woman crying in a way she'd been holding in for 8 months. Sierra had stood in the maintenance corridor with that knowledge for a while. Then she had thought, not just me. There were 340 provisional tier residents in Block 9 alone. Of those, 112 had undergone B-chip integration in the prior 18 months. She knew this because she had been doing, for the past 2 months, what she had told the building's resident coordination node she was doing, running a small informal gathering for bereaved residents weekly in the common room on sublevel 2, grief support. The kind of thing the Muhari's social integration protocols encouraged in principle, because it gave the assessors a clean data stream of high-yield emotional output from one convenient location. She had over 2 months learned who among them was chipped. She had learned which of them had lost people. She had listened, really listened, in the way that Kenji had always said she was extraordinary at, to what they were carrying. A man named Taru who had lost his daughter to a fever the collective's medical system had not prioritized. A woman named Hiromi whose brother had been reclassified and relocated, and who received, every few weeks, a form message saying he was well. A 17-year-old named Soda who had been in Block 9 since he was 9, who had no family at all, who came to the gatherings and mostly sat and said nothing, but always came back. She had not told them what she knew. Not yet. Not until she was sure about the interference mechanism. Not until she had tested it on herself, in the corridor, alone, and confirmed that Kenji's frequency mapping was correct. She had confirmed it on a Thursday evening in late autumn. She had stood in the dark corridor, the device's screen open to the frequency display Kenji had built, and she had let herself cry, Not the 4-minute processing she'd been doing. Not managed. She had let herself go all the way down into it. Into the specific grief of 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days without him. The grief of the empty bowl and the 2 cups and the nights when she woke and reached across the bed and felt only the shape where warmth used to be. She had let herself understand, at full volume, what it meant that he had died for them. Not abstractly, not as a concept, but as the physical fact of his body, the solder smell of him. The way he'd looked at her that last night with that specific expression of a person who knows more than they're saying and loves you enough to say it anyway. The frequency display peaked and held. The transmission band went flat. She had stayed down there for 11 minutes, crying in the dark, and watched the display stay flat the entire time. Then she had wiped her face, checked the display once more, closed the device, and walked back upstairs. She had sat at the low table and eaten a bowl of rice by herself. She had set 2 out of habit. She hadn't touched his. But this time she had looked at it for a long while, the steam rising from it in the cold apartment, and she had thought, "Thank you. Thank you for being smarter than they accounted for. Thank you for knowing that I would find it. Thank you for the 11 extra weeks, for however many you gave me in those entries." She had washed both bowls together and put them away and gone to bed and slept, for the first time in 8 months, without waking. On the following Tuesday she had told Taru, Hiromi, and Soda what she knew. She had expected fear. She had prepared for it. She had prepared explanations, had the device ready to show the documentation, had thought through every objection. What she had not prepared for was that Taru had looked at the frequency display and said, very quietly, that he had suspected something like this since his daughter died. That Hiromi had not asked any questions but had simply reached across the table and put her hand over Sira's. That Soda, 17, wordless Soda, had looked at the documentation for a long time and then looked up with an expression that was not fear and not rage but something harder and more sustainable than either, and said, "Who else?" There were 12 of them in the end. 12 provisional tier residents in Block 9 with B-chips, who had each lost someone they could not fully grieve in front of a window. 12 people who had been, in their individual ways, holding grief somewhere the assessors couldn't reach, in maintenance corridors, in bathrooms with the shower running, in the stairwell between sublevel 3 and the parking level where the node coverage had a dead zone. They gathered on a Thursday in the common room. Sira had told them only that it would be uncomfortable, and that they needed to be in the room together, and that she would explain fully afterward, but that for the purpose of what they were about to do they needed to let themselves feel whatever they had been not feeling in front of the nodes. She had not told them it would be like this. She had not known it would be like this. What happened when 12 people who had been holding grief in private for months let it out in the same room at the same time was not. It was not loud. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. She had expected crying. There was crying, but the predominant texture of it was almost silence. Taru put his face in his hands. Hiromi made no sound at all, but her shoulders shook for a long time. Soda, who had sat with them every week and never said anything, said one word, his sister's name once, very quietly, and then sat with his eyes closed. Sira held the device's display in her lap and watched the transmission band go flat across 12 separate chip frequencies simultaneously. She watched it hold. She held her own part of it, the 2 bowls, the solder smell, the 11 weeks of entries, and let it be real in the room with everyone else's real thing, and the frequency display stayed flat, flat, flat. The assessors registered a sensor anomaly, transmission degradation across multiple channels in Block 9's common area, likely infrastructure age, flag for routine maintenance check, move on. They ran it for 19 minutes. On the 3rd week, the 3rd Thursday, the Muhari network maintenance protocol automatically rerouted the carrier frequency. New band, new channel, same architecture. She had expected this. Kenji had anticipated it in his notes. She had also, over the intervening 2 weeks, contacted 4 other buildings in Provisional Sector Nana through a method the assessors were not monitoring. Face-to-face conversation in the open-air market on Sublevel 6, where the noise from the recycler exhaust masked audio surveillance and the stall canopies blocked overhead line of sight. She had spoken to 2 other people who ran informal grief groups, as she did. People who had, without any coordination, without any plan, arrived at the same basic strategy she had. Give the nodes the flat signal they expect, process the real thing somewhere they can't reach. She had given them Kenji's frequency maps. She had explained what she'd learned. She had said, when they reroute, we need to be in more than one building. The 3rd Thursday they ran it in 4 buildings. The frequency band went flat across 4 nodes simultaneously. The assessors flagged it as a potential network event, cross-sector. She had told no one in the wider network what the end goal was because she was not sure herself what the end goal was. She only knew that each Thursday they ran it, the Muhari had to reroute. Each reroute was costly, not to the network, which was redundant, but to the harvest schedule. The crop was not being collected. Whatever they had come here to take was not getting through. She also knew that this would not last forever. At some point, the assessors would stop attributing the transmission dropouts to infrastructure age and start looking for a cause. At some point, the pattern would resolve. She estimated, between 3 and 6 months before they found her. She had intended to use those months to grow the network further. She had not intended what happened instead. Soda brought someone to the following Thursday. He had not asked permission. He had arrived with a woman Sira had never seen, older, 50s, wearing the kind of clothes that said upper-tier provisional, the kind that said she had been careful for a long time. Soda said, with characteristic brevity, "She knows something you should know." The woman's name was Dr. Naomi Ishida. She had been, before the collective's integration of the medical sector, a neuroscientist specializing in electromagnetic encephalography. She still worked now for the Muhari's Medical Oversight Board, because her skills were useful to them and because she had been, for 3 years, feeding them information while quietly running a parallel study she had never filed anywhere. What she had found, and what she told Sira in 40 minutes of extremely quiet and extremely precise technical language, was this: the grief resonance the Muhari were harvesting was not a consumable commodity. It was a fuel. Specifically, it was the fuel for the probability modeling arrays that the collective used to navigate faster-than-light transit. The arrays required an entropic input, a signal of genuine unresolved loss, because the mathematics of FTL required a continuous entropy source to stabilize the probability cascade, and the electromagnetic signature of human grief mapped, with extraordinary precision, onto the entropic coefficient their transit drives needed. They had been looking for this source for 300 years, across dozens of inhabited systems. Nothing else they had found produced the exact signature at the exact yield. They had found it here, and they had, with remarkable efficiency, built an entire colonial architecture around extracting it. Without the grief fuel, Naomi said, the Muhari FTL fleet could not travel, could not reinforce, could not supply, could not sustain a multi-system empire from a central hub. They would be stranded at whatever star system they were currently nearest, dependent on conventional drives, unable to project power beyond a single light-year radius. They had, according to her estimates, a reserve supply sufficient for approximately 4 months of full operations. After that, without resupply, they would begin to lose the strategic reach that made their empire function. Sira had sat with that for a moment. Then she had said, how many people would need to stop transmitting for how long? Naomi had her numbers ready. She had been waiting, Sira understood, for someone to ask the right question. The number was not small, the duration was not short. What it required was essentially every provisional tier resident with a B chip in every major occupied city, simultaneously, for a sustained period, not minutes but hours, days, weeks, running the interference at full yield. Not individual grief in maintenance corridors. Collective grief, openly, long enough and loud enough to drain the reserve while the farms ran dry. Sierra had thought of her grandmother, the grief carried like a coal, the ferocious attention. She had thought we were never doing this by accident. She had thought of Kenji's last entry, the one that ended mid-sentence, and she had understood that the sentence he hadn't finished was this one. It took 9 weeks to build the network. Not through encrypted channels or covert signals or anything the assessors could detect, through the face-to-face conversations in markets and stairwells, and the maintenance corridors under every building in every sector of a city full of people who were quietly, stubbornly, specifically human in ways the Muhari had never properly accounted for. Through grief groups and neighborhood associations, and the informal webs of care that people build when they are living at the bottom of someone else's system, all of which looked, to the assessor's classification models, like low disruption adaptive coping. She told Taru and Hiromi and Soda what she was building toward. She told them it would not be without consequence. She told them that the Muhari would understand, once it was underway, that the infrastructure degradation was not degradation, and that there would be a response. Taru had said, "My daughter is already dead." Hiromi had said, "My brother is already gone." Soda had said nothing. He had come back the next Thursday and the Thursday after that, and every Thursday until the day. The day was a Thursday in early spring. Provisional sector Nana, and then provisional sectors across the city, and then the linked networks in Osaka and Fukuoka and Sapporo and the 17 other occupied cities, all of them with their grief groups and their informal networks and their maintenance corridors, all of them carrying the same thing in the same direction. Sierra was in the common room of Block 9, Sublevel 2, 12 people around the low tables. Kenji's device in her hands, screen open, frequency display running. She could see, through the network Naomi had quietly built into the display, the signals from 40 other buildings going flat, then 200, then the spread across the city in a wave that moved like something inevitable. She thought of him in the way she always did in this room, fully, without managing it. The solder smell. The way he sat cross-legged on the floor, turning the device over in his hands, speaking carefully because he was frightened and he loved her, and those two things made him choose every word exactly right. The paper fold, the 3-finger tap. The hum that she had practiced 42 times in the dark before she got it right. She thought of the empty bowl of rice. She thought of it every morning when she set it out, and every morning she had told herself it was for him, and now, for the first time, she understood that it was also for this. Not the grief of him being gone, the grief of what he'd known about why and what he'd done with the time he had left to do it. The grief that was not helpless but purposeful, that had a direction. That was the specific human thing the Muhari had never modeled correctly, because they had never understood that human grief was not a passive product. It was a choice about what you did with it. The transmission bands across the city went flat. In the Block 9 common room, 12 people who had each been carrying something alone for a long time sat together and let it be what it was. No one directed it. No one managed it. Taru's hands were over his face. Hiromi sat with her eyes closed and her hands open in her lap. Soda sat the way he always sat, still and careful, and he said his sister's name again. Just once, not loudly, but this time Sierra heard something in it that was less like loss and more like an introduction. Like, here is a person who existed and mattered, and I am saying her name so that it goes somewhere. Outside the window the city went about its day. The assessors registered the anomaly at 22 minutes, flagged it as critical at 38, identified the pattern as deliberate at 51. By that point it was in 40 cities across the country, and the carrier frequency was buried under 300 years of grief. Not theirs, not just these 12, but everyone who had carried it in corridors and showers and stairwells and dark kitchens. Grief that had been processed and metabolized and transformed into something that did not transmit on any frequency the Muhari had mapped, because it was not the raw product they had come here to harvest. It was what the raw product became when humans had enough time and enough stubbornness and enough love for each other to work with it properly. Not a weapon, never a weapon, something older and quieter. The reserve ran out in 73 days. The fleet held position for another 3 weeks while the collective's probability arrays tried to recalibrate, hunting for an alternative entropy source, and the engineers ran the numbers over and over, and eventually the numbers said the same thing every time. This specific product, at this specific yield, did not exist anywhere else they had found. They could wait. They could hold orbit on conventional drives and wait to see if the harvest resumed. But the harvest would not resume, because Sira Machida had figured out what her husband had started and she was not going to stop, and because there were 40 cities full of people who had carried their grief in maintenance corridors and decided, one Thursday, to carry it somewhere else. The fleet departed in late summer. No formal announcement. The assessors simply went offline, node by node, and the city's integration network went quiet, and then the sky was just the sky again, blue and ordinary, no second horizon of cold fire. Sira heard about it from Hiromi, who had been watching the sensor feeds through a monitoring account Naomi had quietly set up. She sent a message, "They're going." Sira was in the common room when she got it. She sat with the device in her hands for a while. The screen showed the frequency display, flat and empty, no transmissions to drown out. She went home, she made rice. She set 2 bowls on the low table. She sat down across from the empty space where he used to be, and she ate her portion, and she looked at his, and she let herself feel everything there was to feel about the fact that he was gone, and that he had known this was possible, and that he had built, in the 9 weeks he'd had, a device that kept the knowledge safe until she could find it and understand it and do something with it that he hadn't lived to see. She thought, "I wish you were here. I'll always wish you were here." She thought, "You knew I'd figure it out." She picked up his bowl and drank from it, just this once, just today, warm and plain and exactly as he would have made it. Then she washed both bowls together, dried them together, and put them away side by side. Tomorrow she would go to the market and talk to people about what came next. There was a great deal of work ahead, the integration network to dismantle, the chip removal program to organize, the medical infrastructure to rebuild, all the ordinary enormous labor of people putting a world back together. There were the other occupied cities, and the question of what help they needed and what could be offered. There was Soda, who had asked yesterday without preamble if she needed help with any of it, and to whom she had said yes. Tonight, though, the window was just a window, the walls were just walls. She put on a light she didn't need and sat on the floor with her back against the table and let herself be in the quiet apartment in the ordinary dark, in the grief that was hers and the gratitude that was hers and the exhaustion and the odd, specific, thoroughly human feeling of not knowing what would happen next and being willing, carefully, to find out. She hummed something her grandmother used to hum, not loudly, just to have the sound of it. Outside, someone else in the building was also making dinner. She could hear it through the wall, the scrape of a pot on a burner, the ordinary domestic percussion of a person feeding themselves at the end of a long day. She listened to it for a while. It sounded like enough.